Joining us now, Army veteran and Medal of Honor recipient, Colonel Jack Jacobs. He's also an MSNBC military analyst. What do you make of this, Colonel?
It is confusing. Spencer was trying to do two things, and they're diametrically opposed. He wanted to do the right thing, that is, which was make sure that Gallagher had his day in administrative court while they determined whether or not he should keep his trident. And secondly, he wanted to keep his job, which is one reason why he went around his boss to the White House. But you can't do that. The other thing you can't do is either accidentally or on purpose publicly say that you're going to resign. I think if you want to resign, you say you're going to resign, you resign. So he's trying to do both of those things, went around the chain of command to do it, and the inevitable happened.
So at the bottom of this thing is this Navy SEAL and what he did and what should have been done about it, right? The president had one view of it. The Navy has a process by which it can make that determination. It's hard to figure out in the story who's on the right side of this.
If you talk,
what does right look like?
Well, if you talk to people who are at or near the top of the food chain, they will all tell you that they're on the side of the Secretary of the Navy. That this guy probably should have lost his trident. Don't forget that he was...
Which means being demoted.
Correct. Well, not just being demoted, but he went through a long process to become a Navy SEAL, to have that qualification removed. Don't forget that Gallagher was turned in by his own sailors, who were witnesses. He was acquitted, but at the end of the day, the Navy had decided that he didn't deserve to be a SEAL anymore. So the guy who did the right thing but the wrong way was the Secretary of the Navy. But meanwhile, recognize the fact that General Milley, who's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, announced today or yesterday, this case is closed. General Milley wants to get this thing as far as possible in his rearview mirror and wants to move on. And the best way to do it is to say, we'll accept what the president said and be done with it.
So when you say people at the top of the food chain, for the most part, probably side with the secretary, you mean people within the military.
Oh, yeah.
For civilians, couldn't they think, well, the top of the food chain or the person in charge or in terms of chain of command is the president, and he can do what he likes?
He can do it. Just because you can do something doesn't mean that you ought to do something. And everybody I talk to says that the president's actions are inimical to order and discipline in the service.
Because there's a process, and if the process doesn't play out, then this becomes...
You got to go through the process. Well, it puts everybody in the chain of command in a bad light. It means that at any time, anybody who does anything can be overruled.
But wait, then are they both going outside the chain of command? Whether we're talking about the secretary going around his boss or the president intervening. If you're somebody who supports chain of command no matter what, which one violated that?
Well, the Secretary of the Navy violated the chain of command by going around his boss, the Secretary of Defense. But you have to ask the question whether or not whoever is at the very top of the food chain ought to be intervening in this kind of stuff when there are processes to go through it. It's a bit like the president of NBC News coming down to a segment producer and saying, you know, there's a comma that goes over here. You know, it makes sure that the system doesn't work.
Thank you, sir, for being with us. Jack Jacobs, colonel in the retired colonel in the U.S. Army and an MSNBC military analyst. Moments ago at the White House, President Trump honored Conan, the Special Forces dog who was injured in the U.S. military raid that led to the death of former ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. The president giving Conan a plaque, calling him, quote, the ultimate fighter. Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.